coffee had only now arrived.
Yes,
so.
I was complaining about that, yeah.
But of course, we could go, you tell me when you want us to go ahead and start.
Yeah, I don't know if you could go out there still. I'll go look.
We'll now be hearing from him who needs no introduction, but a lot of thanks, speaking on Kant, on man, God, and the order of nature. And I want to remind you of Margaret Yee's analogy yesterday about having jumped out the window of a tall building, and now that we're getting very, very close to the ground, you should probably slow down your presentation before you hit.
Yes, thank you. I want to say that I really appreciate all of your work and contributions to the conference over the course of the past several days, and for, I think, advancing significantly our understanding of historical perspectives on God's order, man's order, and the order of nature. This was the main goal of the conference, so I feel like it's been quite useful, certainly to me, and I suspect to others as well. I also want to thank a number of people without which this would not have been possible. James Messina, for example, Peter Yong, and Susan Winchester, who's not here, but was definitely behind the scenes helping out, and of course Rebecca Robinson, who's in charge of everything. So I'm very thankful to all of them. The historical perspective that we've seen throughout the course of the conference has been very varied, which has been, I think, the point of it all, which is that the history can be useful insofar as it suggests all sorts of different options about how to think about a certain set of core issues. And we really have done that because we've heard about the views of Aquinas, Scotus, Occam, Maimonides, Descartes, Hobbes, Malebranche, Spinoza, Leibniz, and Kant, with an unjustifiably minor appearance made by many other figures such as Newton, Suarez, Cruzius, etc. So, but one can only do so much in 2.5 days, so I feel like even with the mere minor appearances, we've I think done well. So thank you for taking the time to be here and contributing, and I hope that we are able to contribute further to the larger order project of which this is one part. Okay, so now my talk really begins. To understand our current situation, whether intellectual or otherwise, it is helpful, perhaps even essential, to recognize where we have come from. It is thus fortunate that over several decades, many excellent scholars have provided us with increasingly sophisticated and comprehensive narratives that purport to describe the most fundamental philosophical aspects of the modern period from which we descend. Accordingly, Loeb has shown us that we should not rest satisfied with simplistic accounts that would divide modern philosophers into rationalist and empiricist camps in an effort to identify the most logically consistent expression of their respective viewpoints. Instead, we should consider whether the most basic issues that drive thought forward during this period are, first, the problem of the criterion and the kind of skepticism that ensues from it, as Popkin claims. Second, the emergence of the new sciences and the task of providing adequate metaphysical and epistemological foundations for them, as Dan Garber contends. Or third, a crisis in the foundations of morality and philosophy of religion that could be solved either with the invention of autonomy, as Schneewin argues, or with an adequate response to the problem of evil, as Husen-Nyman suggests. What is striking amidst the numerous differences between these rich narratives is that they are all consistent with a certain view of Kant's pivotal role in modern philosophy and beyond. For if Descartes and Locke's acceptance of the way of ideas is viewed as the first step in a subjective turn that struggles to accommodate genuine and indubitable scientific knowledge of an independent external world, then Kant's critical revolution in thought can be seen as a further radicalization of this inward turn. For in one fell swoop, Kant destroys all metaphysics as dogmatic, which puts him in a position to synthesize the rationalist and empiricist traditions, refute Humean skepticism, support the new sciences in their most exalted form in Newton's Principia, and allow for a special kind of rational agency and freedom that could be equated with the moral and political ideal of autonomy heralded by all proponents of the Enlightenment, whatever their other differences might be. What many find attractive about Kant today, or at least about the picture of Kant just sketched, is that his rejection of metaphysics allows one to jettison an idea that is prominent both among early modern thinkers and in the narratives offered to account for their innovations, namely that a perfect and transcendent God is ultimately responsible for order in nature and among human beings within it. That is, his critical stance on metaphysics leads him to dispense with the view that God is the ultimate legislator or lawgiver, both of natural law and of the laws of nature. Instead, Kant advances the revolutionary idea that man alone is essentially responsible for creating order within the natural and moral world. Thus, not only does our conception of the world become increasingly secularized throughout the modern period, as Charles Taylor, Israel, and Kelly and Dreyfus have all recently argued, though from rather different perspectives, but it is also anthropomorphized or made dependent on the constructive activities of human beings, as Rawls and his followers have suggested. In short, what many value in Kant's thought today is that his rejection of metaphysics in favor of a distinctively human epistemology and practical philosophy allows him, in effect, to replace God with man within his philosophy, thereby contributing to the fulfillment of the Enlightenment's agenda of progress wrought by human effort. This view of the role of Kant's position within modern philosophy and its contemporary significance is based on genuine and important features of his philosophy. For Kant clearly asserts that reason has a strong prescriptive role with respect to both nature and freedom. As Kant argues in the Critique of Pure Reason, reason, in the form of the understanding, prescribes lawfulness to nature, such that we are responsible for the regularities in nature. And in the Critique of Practical Reason, the moral law is based on autonomy, which is simply a specific kind of self-legislation. Thus, the laws of nature and morality are, in fact, based, in the first instance, on us and not on God. Moreover, unlike many of his predecessors and successors, Kant draws a sharp distinction between intuitive and discursive modes of cognition, and rejects any purely intuitive or theocentric model of cognition as inappropriate for us, given that his conception of human knowledge, with its heavy dependence on distinctively human forms of sensibility, is limited and subjective in a much more radical sense than any of his predecessors had asserted. However, by focusing on three specific issues taken from throughout Kant's critical system, I hope to show that Kant's actual position is both more nuanced and more interesting than the standard narrative has it. First, while Kant does clearly deny in the first critique that we can have theoretical cognition of God's existence, he nonetheless also argues that, even in its theoretical use, reason requires that we form an idea of an ontologically most real being, and assent to the existence of such a being so as to be able to explain the possibility of the empirical objects that we cognize. This point, that reason requires us to think that God grounds all possibility, turns out to have consequences within Kant's overall philosophy that reach much further than has been widely recognized. Second, Kant argues in the second critique that practical reason requires belief in God's existence, since God is needed to bring about the proper proportion of happiness to virtue that is required for the highest good, the possibility of which we necessarily presuppose in acting morally. As a result, Kant's repeated assertion that we can recognize our moral obligations as divine commands makes good sense, even as he rejects certain versions of divine command theories. Thus, even in the face of his emphasis on human autonomy in the moral realm, Kant does not view the acceptance of God's existence as optional, much less as prohibited. nor, for that matter, does he reject the idea that God commands obedience to the moral law. Now, Kant's moral argument for the necessity of postulating God's existence has been widely criticized, and I'm not proposing to defend it against all objections. But I do want to suggest that the broader context in which it arises can render it defensible against two central objections. Specifically, Kant's argument can appear in a better light if one starts with what Kant takes himself to have already established, namely that we are required to assent to God's existence, where that is understood very minimally in terms of merely transcendental or ontological predicates, and secondly, if one views its task as demonstrating the necessity of God's specifically moral attributes. Third, in the critique of the power of judgment, Kant's third great critique, Kant argues that the contradiction expressed in the antinomy of teleological judgment regarding the mechanical inexplicability of organisms can be resolved only if, first, mechanistic laws are subordinated to teleological laws, and second, if appeal is made to a supersensible ground. What has remained mysterious about Kant's views here is specifically how these claims actually allow one to avoid the contradiction between the thesis and antithesis that form the antinomy, as well as, in general, what implications they have for understanding the ensuing system of nature with its mechanistic and teleological laws. If, however, we identify the supersensible ground with God, where God is understood now in terms of what Kant had previously established in the first and second critiques, then we can, I suggest, provide answers to these questions. We can resolve the contradiction between the thesis and the antithesis because what is possible for a merely discursive understanding, such as our own, can be different from what might be possible for the divine intellect. In particular, given what Kant is committed to in the second critique, we have reason to believe that God, that is the supersensible principle, uses the metaphysically necessary mechanistic laws to further the teleological aims of rational agents that are ends in themselves by proportioning the natural goodness aimed at in teleology to the moral goodness that rational agents have managed to achieve. In 3 sections, I shall attempt to argue these 3 points, or at least suggest how arguments might go in these 3 points. So, first, the ground of possibility. Now, much attention has been devoted to Kant's rejection in the first critique of metaphysics in general and of the 3 traditional theistic proofs in particular, with his criticism of the ontological argument deserving special mention. Comparably little consideration has been given, by contrast, to Kant's positive assertions about God within his theoretical philosophy. To redress this state of affairs in at least a small measure, I want to take note of 2 central points before adding 3 crucial qualifications. The first and most basic point to note is that Kant does in fact think that we can form an intelligible idea of God, and that we can do so by extending our categories beyond what can be given to us in sensible intuition. It is true that Kant does sometimes say that when we free the categories from their sensible conditions, such representations are without sense and meaning, ohne Sinn und Bedeutung, which has in turn led some to think that for Kant the very idea of God must be literally meaningless. However, reflection on the terms Kant uses here and on the nature of his project in the first critique and beyond reveals that we must be able to form some kind of meaningful idea of God. Kant's most general point in saying that the categories are without sense and meaning when freed from their sensible conditions is typically that we cannot have the requisites of theoretical cognition, not that these very ideas are meaningless. For sense and meaning are technical terms that denote, at least sometimes in Kant's corpus, what it would be like for the object to be given to us and demonstrable reference, respectively. So to say that our idea of God is without sense and meaning is to say that we do not know what that object would be like for us if it were given to us in experience, and that we also cannot demonstrate that and how our idea refers to an object, even if it does in fact refer to the object. and doesn't mean that we just have no idea what we're talking about when we use the term.